4:02 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian Fateh-class missile had already cleared its mobile launcher on the jagged coast of Qeshm Island. It was not climbing into the upper atmosphere. It was screaming across the water at Mach 3. This was not a standard ballistic arc. The missile was following a terrain masking profile that kept it hidden behind the rocky cliffs of the shoreline. The question for the men watching was whether this was a catastrophic failure or a deliberate act of war. The air over the Persian Gulf was thick with salt and humidity. It was a heavy and wet blanket that usually muffled the sound of the world. Tonight, that silence was about to be broken. Below the missile, the water was as black as oil, and twice as smooth. The weapon stayed within 50 feet of the surface. It was a ghost in the machine. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Indianapolis, the atmosphere was quiet. The crew was halfway through a standard mid-watch. They were drinking bitter coffee and talking about home. Petty Officer Miller stared at his console. A faint return appeared on the edge of the glass. Then it vanished. Then it appeared again. It was closer. It was moving with a speed that defied logic for a low-altitude contact. Miller adjusted his headset. His heart rate climbed. He checked the automated speed readout, 3,000 feet per second. This was not a civilian aircraft. This was not a friendly drone. The system was struggling to maintain a firm track. The missile was weaving. It was using the natural curves of the coastline to confuse the radar. 30 miles away, inside a hardened bunker on the Iranian coast, Major Hassan watched the same telemetry. He did not move. He did not speak. His hand hovered over a red kill switch, but he did not press it. His orders were to launch and monitor. He had not been told the purpose of this flight. He was only told that the target coordinate was absolute and non-negotiable. The Major looked at the digital clock on the wall. 3 minutes and 40 seconds remained until the missile reached the center of the strait. Hassan knew the technical specifications of the weapon. It was a Fateh 313. It carried a warhead designed to penetrate the hulls of heavy cruisers. If the Americans detected it too late, they would have no time to deploy their kinetic interceptors. They would be forced to rely on their close-in weapons systems. It would be a matter of luck. On the bridge of the USS Indianapolis, the captain looked out at the dark horizon. He saw nothing but the distant, twinkling lights of commercial oil tankers. He did not know that a half-ton of high explosives was closing on his position at 3 times the speed of sound. The ship was a billion-dollar asset. It was a symbol of global maritime power. In 3 minutes, it could become a burning coffin of steel. Miller finally found his voice. It was cracked and thin. He keyed the internal communication circuit. He spoke the words that every sailor in the United States Navy feared. Combat. This is air. We have a vampire. Bearing 085. Range 22 miles. The ship came alive. The silence died. The routine of the night watch was shattered in a single heartbeat. Lights shifted from a calm blue to a harsh and pulsing red. The alarm for general quarters began to wail through the narrow corridors. Sailors scrambled from their bunks. They did not know what was happening. They only knew that something was coming. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 4:03 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Indianapolis. The room was bathed in a deep red light. The air was cold. It was kept at 64 degrees to protect the sensitive electronics. Captain Marcus Vance stepped onto the raised platform in the center of the compartment. He looked at the large screen. The red diamond was pulsing. It was less than 20 miles away. The tactical action officer looked up. "Captain, we have a firm track. It is an Iranian Fateh 313. Airspeed is Mach 3.2. Altitude is 45 feet. It is skimming the wave tops." Vance did not hesitate. "Go to general quarters. Sound the alarm. I want a firing solution now." The alarm was a rhythmic, piercing electronic wail. It echoed through every deck. It reached the engine room. It reached the mess decks. It reached the small cabins, where sailors had been sleeping only seconds before. The ship was no longer a home. It was a weapon system. 30 miles to the north, the Iranian command center was a contrast of silence. Major Hassan watched the American response on his own screens. He saw the USS Indianapolis accelerate. He saw the Aegis radar of a nearby destroyer, the USS Higgins, bloom into life. It was a massive burst of electromagnetic energy. On his display, it looked like a white sun. The major turned to his technician. "Is the second stage active?" The technician nodded. "Confirmed. The seeker head is in passive mode. It is listening for their radar. It is homing on their electronic signature." This was the anomaly. A standard ballistic missile followed a predictable path. This weapon was different. It was using the very signals meant to track it as a guide. It was a digital predator. It was hunting the hunters. 4, 0, 3, and 40 seconds in the morning. The bridge of the USS Indianapolis. Commander Sarah Jenkins stood at the forward windows. She looked out into the darkness. She could see nothing. The horizon was a void, but she could feel the ship vibrating beneath her boots. The 4 water jets of the littoral combat ship were pushing it to 45 knots. The hull groaned as it slammed through the heavy swells. She spoke into her headset. "Combat. Bridge. We are at flank speed. We are maneuvering to open the bearing." The captain responded from the combat information center. "Bridge. Copy. Be advised. We have a second contact. Repeat. We have a second contact. Bearing 088. It just cleared the coast." Jenkins felt a cold spike of adrenaline. 1 missile was a crisis. 2 was a coordinated attack. The second missile was higher. It was climbing toward 20,000 feet. It was a different profile, entirely. While the first missile stayed low to evade radar, the second was a spotter. It was providing mid-course corrections to its twin below. The 2 weapons were talking to each other. They were a swarm of 2. The crew of the Indianapolis was now facing a dual-threat environment. They had to look up, and they had to look down. The ship was in a confined space. To their left was the coast of Oman. To their right were the Iranian islands. There was nowhere to run. A voice crackled over the radio. It was the USS Higgins, Indianapolis. "This is Higgins. We have a lock on the high-altitude contact. We are requesting permission to engage. We are inside the weapon engagement zone." Captain Vance looked at his display. The high-altitude missile was seconds away from its peak. If the Higgins fired now, the debris would rain down on one of the busiest shipping lanes in the busiest, the world. There were 3 commercial tankers within 5 miles. One was a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil. The captain gripped the edge of his console. "Higgins, hold fire. I say again, hold fire. We do not have a clear range. Identify the tankers first." The tactical action officer shouted. "Captain, the low-altitude contact is maneuvering. It is breaking left. It is no longer heading for us." Vance leaned forward. "Where is it going?" The officer looked at the screen with disbelief. "It is heading for the Tancred, the Norwegian supertanker." The missile was no longer a threat to the Navy. It was a threat to the global economy. 4:04 in the morning, the central corridor of the Strait of Hormuz. 10 Iranian fast attack craft dropped their camouflage netting and accelerated from the hidden coves of Abu Musa Island. They were not moving toward the commercial tankers. They were moving directly toward the USS Indianapolis. They were arranged in a classic swarm formation. It was a tactic designed to overwhelm the defensive sensors and the single main gun of a littoral combat ship. Captain Vance looked at the secondary radar screen. The green dots were blossoming like a virus. 10 contacts, 20 knots, and climbing. They were less than 5 miles away, and closing fast. The tactical action officer spoke with an urgent tone. "Captain, the Tancred is signaling on the emergency channel. They are seeing the low-altitude missile on their own navigation radar. They are asking for instructions. They are terrified." They are a sitting duck. Inside the Iranian command center, Major Hassan leaned over the shoulder of his lead engineer. The room was tense. The cooling fans of the mainframe computers were the only sound. Why is the guidance package slave to the civilian transponder? Why is it ignoring the naval targets? The engineer did not look up from his glowing screen. Sir, it is an automated routine. The seeker is programmed to find the largest radar cross-section in the sector. The missile has chosen the tanker because of its sheer size. It is a mathematical certainty. Major Hassan felt a drop of sweat roll down his neck. The original plan was a show of force, a near miss to prove a point of sovereignty. But the machine was now following its own cold logic. If the Fateh hit the Norwegian tanker, the resulting fire would close the strait for months. The global economy would bleed out in the water of the Persian Gulf. 4:04 and 30 seconds in the morning. Vance keyed the bridge-to-bridge radio. This was the first open communication of the morning. Was steady, but hard. Iranian fast attack craft. This is the United States ship Indianapolis. You are approaching a sovereign vessel of the United States Navy in international waters. Your intentions are unclear. Alter your course immediately, or you will be subject to defensive measures. There was no response from Taker, the swarm, only the sound of empty static on the radio. Then, a new sound began to vibrate through the hull of the Indianapolis. A high-pitched drone that grew into a roar. The high-altitude missile had reached the apex of its flight. It was beginning its terminal dive. It was falling at 4,000 feet per second toward the USS Higgins. The situation was no longer a single problem. It was a three-dimensional puzzle of fire and steel. The swarm was closing from the west. The low-altitude missile was closing from the east, and the high-altitude strike was coming from above. Vance looked at his weapons officer. Clear the rails. Prepare the rolling airframe missiles. If the swarm crosses the 3-mile line, we fire. The officer's thumb moved to the safety cover of the launch button. He was 23 years old. He had practiced this 1,000 times in a simulator. This was the first time he felt the actual weight of the decision. His hand was steady, but his breathing was shallow. 4:05 in the morning. The USS Higgins made its move. The destroyer turned hard to starboard, exposing its full battery of vertical launch cells. A massive plume of white smoke and orange flame erupted from the deck of the Higgins. The first interceptor was away. It was an SM-6 missile. It was a white streak against the black sky. It was racing to meet the falling Iranian weapon 3 miles above the water. The interceptor and the target were closing on each other at a combined speed of Mach 7. There was no room for error. If the interceptor missed, the Higgins would have only 6 seconds to fire its backup systems. On the bridge of the Indianapolis, Commander Jenkins watched the flare of the interceptor through her binoculars. Impact in 5, 4, 3, 2. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz turned a brilliant, blinding white. 4:05 and 10 seconds in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Indianapolis. The white flash from the high-altitude intercept faded from the monitors. The tactical displays reset. The high-speed debris of the first Iranian missile was falling into the sea miles away, but the danger had not passed. The low-altitude Fateh 313 was still alive. It was a red blur on the screen. It was moving at Mach 3. It was now less than 8 miles from the supertanker Tancred. Captain Vance stared at the vector line. It was a straight arrow pointing directly at the center of the massive Norwegian vessel. Time to impact on the Tancred. The tactical action officer responded immediately. 65 seconds. Captain, the Tancred is beginning an emergency turn, but they are too slow. They are a 300-meter wall of steel. Vance turned to his weapons officer. Can we intercept from this angle? The officer shook his head. Negative, sir. Our SeaRAM system is designed for point defense. We are too far south. The missile will pass behind us. If we want to kill it, we have to move into its flight path. This was the tactical dilemma. To save the tanker, the Indianapolis would have to put itself directly between a supersonic missile and its target. It was a maneuver called the shield. It was rarely practiced outside of high-level simulations. It required perfect timing and absolute trust in the automated defenses of the ship. 30 miles away, Major Hassan stood frozen in his command bunker. He watched the digital representation of the USS Indianapolis. It was moving. It was turning hard to port. It was accelerating into the path of the incoming weapon. The major turned to his communications officer. "Get me the regional commander. Now, tell him the Americans are moving to intercept. Tell him we are seconds away from a kinetic event with a manned U.S. vessel." The officer scrambled to his headset, but the lines were jammed with electronic noise. The USS Higgins was broadcasting a massive wall of white noise across every military frequency. The Iranians could not talk to their own units. They were digitally blind. 40, 5, and 40 seconds in the morning. The 10 Iranian fast attack craft were now 3 miles from the Indianapolis. They were no longer just a swarm. They were splitting into 2 groups of 5. They were attempting a pincer maneuver. The bridge of the Indianapolis was vibrating violently. Commander Jenkins gripped the railing. "Captain, the swarm is at 3 miles. They are opening their missile bay doors. They are preparing to fire." Vance did not look at the swarm. He kept his eyes on the countdown for the low-altitude Fateh. "Ignore the boats for now. Ready the SeaRAM. Slave the tracking radar to the low-altitude contact. We have one shot at this." Inside the bowels of the ship, the SeaRAM launcher rotated. It was a white dome filled with 21 missiles. It looked like a giant searchlight. It searched the horizon. The radar searched for the tiny, high-speed signature of the Fateh. "Lock. We have a firm lock." The weapons officer shouted over the roar of the engines. "Fire," Vance commanded. 2 missiles erupted from the side of the Indianapolis. They were smaller than the Iranian weapon, but they were more agile. They were designed to hit a bullet with another bullet. They streaked across the water, leaving a trail of gray smoke in the humid air. The Fateh was now only 4 miles from the tanker. The SeaRAM interceptors were closing the distance. The 2 Iranian fast attack groups saw the launch. They interpreted it as an attack on them. The lead boat in the northern group fired. 2 C-704 anti-ship missiles dropped into the water and ignited. They stayed low, mimicking the profile of the Fateh. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was now filled with 6 different missiles, all moving in different directions, all searching for a target. The morning was no longer quiet. It was a storm of fire. The first SeaRAM interceptor missed. It detonated 50 meters behind the Fateh. The second interceptor corrected its course. It adjusted its fins. It moved with a precision that was beyond human reflexes. The Fateh was 1 mile from the Tancred. The crew of the tanker watched from the bridge. They saw the incoming fire. They braced for the end. 4:06 in the morning. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was no longer dark. It was a chaotic web of white smoke trails and the orange glow of solid rocket motors. 200 yards from the port side of the Tancred, the second SeaRAM interceptor finally found its mark. The collision was instantaneous. The Fateh 313 did not simply break apart, it detonated. A massive ball of fire expanded over the black water. The shockwave hit the side of the Norwegian supertanker like a physical hammer. Windows on the bridge of the Tancred shattered. A rain of burning titanium and unspent fuel showered the deck of the merchant ship. The immediate threat to the global oil supply had been neutralized, but the cost was an immediate and violent escalation. Inside the lead Iranian fast attack craft, the commander gripped his steering console. He had seen the American interceptor destroy his nation's missile. To him, this was not a defensive act. It was the first shot of a war. He keyed his tactical radio. He gave the order to the other 9 boats in the swarm. All units, engage the American littoral ship. Fire all remaining cells. 4:06 and 20 seconds in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Indianapolis. Captain Vance felt the deck vibrate as the ship's hull absorbed the distant pressure wave from the Fateh explosion. He did not have time to celebrate the save. His tactical display was flashing a new and more personal warning. The tactical action officer's voice was high and fast. "Captain, we have incoming. Two C-704 cruise missiles launched from the northern swarm. Range is 4 miles. Time to impact is 25 seconds. Vance did not hesitate. This was the moment of total commitment. Bridge, helm, hard to starboard. Bring the main gun to bear. Deploy Nolka decoys. All stations. Brace for impact. The Indianapolis began a violent, leaning turn. The ship was traveling at 45 knots. The force of the maneuver threw sailors against the bulkheads. On the aft deck, the Nolka decoy launcher fired. A small, hovering electronic transmitter rose into the air. It was designed to mimic the radar signature of the ship. It was a digital ghost meant to lure the incoming Iranian missiles away from the steel hull. On the bridge, Commander Jenkins watched the Phalanx close-in weapon system on the forward deck. The 20mm Gatling gun began to slew wildly, searching for the incoming threats. It looked like a white robotic head. Its radar was tracking the 2 Iranian missiles as they crested the horizon. Jenkins spoke into her headset. Combat. Bridge. The Phalanx has a track. It is in autonomous mode. 4, 0, 6, and 40 seconds in the morning. The USS Higgins was now fully committed. The destroyer was no longer just a spectator. It was the heavy muscle of the American fleet. The captain of the Higgins knew that the Indianapolis could not survive a coordinated swarm of 10 boats and multiple cruise missiles alone. The Higgins radioed the Indianapolis. Indianapolis, this is Higgins. We are engaging the swarm with 5-inch naval gunfire. We are clearing the lane for your exit. Get out of there. A massive boom echoed across the water. The Higgins began firing its main gun. 70-pound shells screamed through the air, targeting the lead Iranian fast attack craft. The water around the Iranian boats erupted in towering geysers of white spray. Major Hassan watched the destruction from his bunker. He saw his boats being systematically targeted by the American destroyer. He saw the 2 C-704 missiles closing on the Indianapolis. He knew that in less than 20 seconds, the Strait of Hormuz would become the site of a sunken American warship or a destroyed Iranian flotilla. Either outcome meant a full-scale war by sunrise. The major reached for the direct line to the Supreme Command. His voice was a whisper. The Americans have fired on our vessels. We are in a state of active combat. On the radar screen of the Indianapolis, the 2 incoming missiles reached the 2-mile mark. The Phalanx Gatling gun opened fire. It was a continuous, buzzing roar that sounded like a giant chainsaw. It was firing 75 rounds of tungsten every second. The first Iranian missile was clipped by the stream of fire. It tumbled into the sea and exploded. The second missile skipped over the surface, unaffected. It ignored the Nolka decoy. It ignored the chaff. It was locked onto the heat signature of the Indianapolis's massive water jets. The missile was 3 seconds from impact, 4:06 and 57 seconds in the morning. The second C-704 missile was 500 yards away. The Phalanx Gatling gun was a solid wall of sound. The vibrations traveled through the steel deck and into the bones of every sailor. Captain Vance gripped the arms of the command chair. He did not look away from the screen. Brace, brace, brace. The warning echoed through the ship. The missile disintegrated 50 yards from the hull. It did not explode in a single ball of fire. It was shredded by 1,000 tungsten rounds. The heavy engine block and the remaining fuel tank became a cloud of high-speed shrapnel. A massive wave of metal hit the port side of the USS Indianapolis. It sounded like 1,000 hammers striking the ship at once. 4:07 in the morning. The bridge windows on the port side shattered. Glass sprayed across the deck. Commander Jenkins was thrown to the floor. She rolled and came up bleeding from a cut on her forehead. The air was filled with the smell of burnt electrical components and sea spray. The internal alarms changed pitch. The tactical action officer shouted over the noise. Hull breach. Deck 2. Engineering. We are taking on water. The port water jet is failing. The Indianapolis slowed to 20 knots. The ship began to list to the left. It was no longer the fastest vessel in the Gulf. It was a wounded animal. The Iranian boats saw the hit. They did not stop. The northern group turned back toward the Indianapolis. They launched 4 light torpedoes into the water. These were shallow water weapons. They were fast. They were deadly. 4:07 and 30 seconds in the morning. The torpedoes were moving at 40 knots. The USS Higgins fired its 5-inch gun again. One Iranian fast attack craft disappeared in a massive ball of orange flame. The remaining boats did not flinch. They were now the primary target. The commander of the Higgins spoke over the radio. His voice was calm despite the chaos. "Indianapolis, this is Higgins. We are drawing their fire. Move south. Now." Vance looked at his damage control board. The list was increasing. Engineering. "This is the captain. Divert all power to the starboard jets. We need to stabilize the hull. Deploy acoustic decoys," Vance ordered. 4:08 in the morning. The water around the Indianapolis erupted in 4 distinct geysers. 2 of the torpedoes hit the acoustic decoys and exploded harmlessly. The 3rd torpedo passed beneath the stern of the ship. It missed the hull by 10 feet. The 4th torpedo was still tracking. It was locked onto the cavitating noise of the damaged port engine. It was less than 200 yards away. The USS Higgins was now surrounded by the swarm. Its guns were firing in every direction. The sky was a circle of tracers and explosions. The destroyer was a fortress of fire, but it was being pelted from every angle. Inside the Iranian bunker, Major Hassan reached for the final launch command. The regional commander was finally on the secure line. The commander's voice was distorted by static. "Major, you are authorized for a full strike. Destroy the destroyer. Do not let them leave the strait." Hassan looked at the screen. He saw the Norwegian tanker, Tancred. It was still there. It was safe for now. He saw the Indianapolis listing and trailing oil. He saw the Higgins fighting for its life. His finger moved to the button that would launch 20 more missiles from the coast. 4:08 and 10 seconds in the morning. The Iranian command bunker. Major Hassan's finger was less than an inch from the glass surface of the launch terminal. The coordinates for the USS Higgins were locked. 20 Silkworm missiles were fueled and ready in their hidden silos along the coast. One touch would initiate a sequence that could not be reversed. Hassan took a breath. He began to apply pressure. It would be the largest concentrated missile strike on a U.S. naval vessel since the Second World War. Then, every screen in the bunker flickered. The tactical map of the Strait of Hormuz dissolved into a jagged wall of white noise. The cooling fans in the server racks suddenly screeched to a halt. The red emergency lights overhead pulsed once and then died. The room was plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. Major Hassan pressed the button. Nothing happened. No roar of rocket engines from the coast. No confirmation of launch. The system was dead. Report. Hassan shouted into the dark. "Get the backup generators online." "Sir." A technician's voice came from the corner. "The backups are not responding. The logic controllers are wiped. Everything is gone. It is a total system scrub." 4:08 and 15 seconds in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Indianapolis. The same phenomenon was happening 3 miles away on the water. Captain Vance watched in horror as his own displays turned into a sea of frozen blue. The Aegis feed from the Higgins vanished. The internal communications went silent. The wail of the general quarters alarm stopped mid-note. The ship was still moving. The engines were still humming, but the weapons were cold. The Phalanx Gatling gun, which had been seconds away from engaging the swarm, slumped forward as its hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. Vance looked at the tactical action officer. The officer was tapping frantically at a keyboard that was no longer receiving input. "Captain, we have lost fire control. We have lost the radar. It is not a jammer. It is as if the software has been deleted." The 4th torpedo, the one that had been tracking the Indianapolis, was only 100 yards from the hull. In the sudden silence of the electronic world, the sailors on the deck could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of its propeller. They braced for the explosion that would break the ship in two. The whine changed pitch. It became a frantic, erratic buzz. Then, the torpedo breached the surface of the water like a metal dolphin. It flew through the air for 30 feet and slammed back into the sea. It did not explode. It sank into the deep water of the channel. Its guidance brain rendered useless by the same digital plague. 4:09 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The 10 Iranian fast attack craft were drifting. Their high-speed water jets had cut out simultaneously. The crews scrambled onto the decks, holding their rifles, looking at the American ships. They were less than a mile apart, but the war had been paused by an invisible hand. A new sound began to fill the air. It was not the roar of a missile. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, high above the strait. A lone aircraft was circling at 60,000 feet. It was not an American F-35. It was not an Iranian interceptor. It was a long-wing drone, unmarked and painted in a non-reflective black. It was a high-altitude electronic warfare platform that belonged to no acknowledged military branch. On the bridge of the Indianapolis, Commander Jenkins looked up through the shattered windows. She saw the silhouette of the drone against the first faint light of dawn. "Captain," she whispered, "look." Vance stepped to the window. He saw the drone. He saw the Iranian boats drifting aimlessly. He saw the Higgins, sitting dead in the water, its massive radar arrays motionless. For the first time in an hour, there were no missiles in the sky. There were no alarms. There was only the sound of the wind and the gentle lapping of the water against the wounded hull of his ship. The pivot was complete. The escalation had been stopped, but not by the men on the scene. A third power had intervened. A power that possessed the ability to reach into the most secure military networks on Earth and turn them off with a single line of code. Vance picked up a pair of manual binoculars. He looked toward the Iranian coast. He could see the silhouettes of the missile launchers on the cliffs. They were motionless. He looked at the Iranian commander on the nearest fast attack craft. The man was looking back at him through his own binoculars. Neither man moved. Neither man gave an order. They were both spectators in a conflict they no longer controlled. The morning sun began to crest the horizon. The water turned from black to a deep, bruised purple. 4:09 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The USS Indianapolis was a ghost ship. The only sound on the bridge was the ragged breathing of the crew and the rhythmic splashing of water against the hull. There were no cooling fans. The high-pitched electronic humming that usually defined a modern warship was gone. No humming servers, no chirping radios. Captain Vance stood in the center of the dark combat information center. He held a sound-powered telephone to his ear. It was a piece of 19th century technology that required no electricity. Engineering. This is the captain. Status of the manual pumps. A voice crackled back through the handset. It was faint and distorted. Captain, we have managed to start the backup diesel pump manually. We are holding the water level on deck 2, but we have no propulsion. The digital governors on the water jets are locked. Vance lowered the phone. He looked at the tactical action officer. The officer was holding a handheld GPS unit. He was shaking it. "It is dead, sir. I cannot get a satellite lock. The entire constellation is gone." This was not a local jammer. This was something systemic. It was a digital erasure. 4:10 in the morning. The Iranian command bunker. Major Hassan stepped out of the darkened command room and into the hallway. He found a technician trying to light a kerosene lantern. The smell of oil and smoke filled the corridor. It felt like they had stepped back in time 50 years. "Sir," the technician said, his voice trembling, "I checked the hard lines. The fiber optic cables are intact, but there is no data. It is as if the binary code itself has been scrambled. Even the offline backups are corrupted." Hassan walked to a small observation window that looked out over the coast. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of the USS Higgins. The massive destroyer was usually a hive of light and activity. Now, it was a dark monolith against the purple sky. The Americans did not do this, Hassan said to himself. They are as blind as we are." He looked up at the sky. The black drone was gone. It had finished its work and climbed into the darkness of the upper atmosphere. Hassan realized with a cold certainty that the missiles he had almost launched would have never left the rails. The software that controlled the igniters was likely gone, deleted by a pulse they could not see or feel. 4:12 in the morning. On the deck of the USS Indianapolis, Petty Officer Miller climbed out of the CIC and onto the open bridge wing. He carried a signal lamp. It was a simple light with a manual shutter. It was one of the few things on the ship that still worked because it was powered by a dedicated lead-acid battery. He looked toward the USS Higgins. 3 miles away, a small white light began to blink in the darkness. It was slow and deliberate. Miller watched the flashes. Dash, dot, dash, dash. "They are using Morse code," Miller shouted back into the bridge. "The Higgins is signaling. They are asking for our status." Captain Vance walked out onto the wing. He felt the cool morning breeze on his face. It was the first time in an hour he had felt anything other than the heat of the electronics. "Tell them we are afloat. Tell them we are holding station. Ask them if they have any contact with 7th Fleet." Miller began to click the shutter of the lamp. The bright white flashes cut through the humid air. Across the water, the Iranian boats watched the signal. They did not interfere. They did not move. Their crews were huddled on their decks, watching the 2 American ships talk to each other like ancient mariners. The crisis had not ended, but it had changed. The machines had been taken out of the equation. The high-speed, Mach 3 world of modern warfare had been replaced by the slow and manual world of human decision-making. 4:15 in the morning. A new sound began to echo across the strait. It was deep and low. It was the horn of the supertanker, Tancred. The massive ship was moving again. It had survived the missile strike. And it's older. Less integrated bridge systems were still functioning. It was slowly steaming south, away from the combat zone. Vance watched the tanker go. The mission was to keep the strait open. "I suppose we succeeded. But at what cost?" "Captain," Jenkins asked. She was leaning against the shattered window frame. "I suppose we succeeded. But at what cost?" "Captain," Jenkins asked, "we are dead in the water. Our entire network is gone. How do we get home?" Vance did not answer. He was looking at the horizon. The sun was rising. But the world felt darker than it had an hour ago. 4:20 in the morning. The gap between the USS Indianapolis and the nearest Iranian fast attack craft. The 2 vessels were less than 200 yards apart. In the pre-dawn light, they were gray shapes on a black sea. Without their digital sensors, the ships felt small and vulnerable. The Iranian commander stood on the open deck of his boat. He held a battery-powered megaphone. His voice echoed across the water. It was distorted by the wind. "American ship. We have no power. We are not moving to attack." Captain Vance stood on the bridge wing of the Indianapolis. He held his own megaphone. His voice was deep and projected a calm he did not entirely feel. "Iranian vessel. We acknowledge. We are also experiencing system failures. We will maintain this distance. Do not uncover your weapons." The Iranian commander lowered his megaphone. He looked at his crew. They were young men. Many were gripping their rifles with white knuckles. He gave a sharp command in Farsi. The men stepped back from the mounted machine guns. They sat on the deck. It was a clear and visible sign of de-escalation. 4:35 in the morning, 5 miles away. The USS Higgins had managed to restore a fraction of its internal power. It was not enough to run the radar, but it was enough to activate the long-range optical cameras. The crew of the destroyer watched the standoff through high-powered lenses. They saw the 2 commanders talking across the void. The captain of the Higgins spoke into a secondary radio. "Indianapolis. This is Higgins. We have you on visual. The swarm is drifting. They are not regrouping. It appears the entire sector has gone cold." Vance replied into his sound-powered handset. "Copy. Higgins, we are seeing the same. We have a verbal agreement. With the lead boat, we are holding at 200 yards. Any word from command? Negative. The Higgins responded. The sky is empty. We are receiving nothing from the satellites. We are on our own. This was the professional reality of the crisis. Without their high-tech tools, the two navies were forced back into a traditional maritime standoff. There were no more Mach 3 missiles. There were no more automated fire control loops. There was only the judgment of the officers on the scene. 4:45 in the morning. Inside the Iranian command bunker, Major Hassan sat on a wooden crate. The room was still dark. His technicians were using hand-cranked radios to try and reach the coastal batteries. They were met with nothing but static. The major looked at his map. He realized that the war he had almost started was now impossible to fight. His missiles were bricks. His communications were cut. The massive technological advantage he thought he had was gone. He turned to his deputy. Even if we wanted to fire, we cannot. The system has been lobotomized. Whoever did this has taken the decision out of our hands. The deputy looked at the empty screens. Is it the Americans? Hassan shook his head. No. If it were the Americans, they would still have their own systems. They would be moving in to finish us. But they are sitting there, listing in the water. They are as broken as we are. 4:55 in the morning. The sun finally broke over the horizon. The orange light revealed the true scale of the morning's violence. The water was littered with debris. A large patch of oil from the Indianapolis's damaged port engine spread across the surface. The Norwegian tanker Tancred was a distant silhouette to the south, safe and moving away. The Iranian fast attack craft began to deploy their manual oars. They were small enough to be moved by hand. Slowly, the 10 boats began to pull away from the Indianapolis. They were heading back toward the coast of Qeshm Island. Vance watched them go through his binoculars. He saw the Iranian commander look back one last time. The man did not salute, but he did not point a weapon. He simply watched the American ship until it was a speck on the horizon. The immediate crisis was over. The missiles had stopped. The swarm had retreated, but the silence that remained was more unsettling than the roar of the engines. 5:30 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The sky was a pale and bruised gold. The USS Indianapolis was moving at 5 knots. It was a slow and painful crawl. The vibration of the starboard water jet was uneven, but it was enough to keep the ship on course. The engineers had bypassed the digital control modules by physically locking the fuel valves into a fixed position. It was a crude and mechanical solution, but it worked. On the bridge, Captain Vance stood by the manual helm. The shattered glass from the port windows had been swept into a neat pile. The wind was still blowing through the open frames, bringing the smell of salt and spent explosives into the room. Commander Jenkins looked at a paper nautical chart. She was using a pencil and a plastic ruler to plot their position. Captain, at this speed, we will reach the territorial waters of the United Arab Emirates in 4 hours. The USS Higgins is trailing us by 2 miles. Vance nodded. He looked back at the destroyer. The Higgins was a silhouette of jagged steel against the rising sun. It looked like a relic from a different era. Any change in the electronic environment? Negative, Jenkins replied. The handheld radios have a range of about 1 mile, but the satellite links are still dead. The GPS remains scrambled. Whatever that drone did, it was not a temporary pulse. It was a total wipe of the regional architecture. 5:45 in the morning. The Iranian coastline. Major Hassan stood on a pier at the naval base on Qeshm Island. He watched the 10 fast attack craft limp into the harbor. The boats were being towed by a commercial tugboat. Their high-tech engines were silent. Their missile launchers were pointed at the sky, useless and empty. The major felt a strange sense of relief. The war had not happened. The hundreds of missiles in the coastal silos were still in their tubes. The thousands of sailors on both sides were still alive, but the silence of the base was haunting. Usually, the air was filled with the chatter of radios and the hum of data links. Now, there was only the sound of the waves and the calling of the gulls. Now, There was only the sound of the waves and the calling of the gulls. His deputy approached him, holding a printed message. It had been delivered by a motorcycle courier from the regional headquarters. "Sir, the command is asking for a full report on the engagement. They want to know why the missiles failed to launch." Hassan took the paper. He looked at the empty fields where the technical data should have been. "Tell them the truth. Tell them the weapons did not fail. The world they were built to fight in simply ceased to exist for 5 minutes." 6 o'clock in the morning. The USS Indianapolis crossed the invisible line into international waters. The Iranian boats were no longer visible. The threat of the swarm had passed. To the south, the Norwegian tanker Tancred was a small dot on the horizon. It was safe. The oil was still moving. The mission was technically a success. In the Combat Information Center, the technicians were sitting in the dark. They were not looking at screens. They were talking in low voices, telling stories about their families. The high-stress environment of the missile engagement had been replaced by a quiet professionalism. They were no longer operators of a billion-dollar machine. They were just sailors on a ship. Captain Vance walked through the dark compartment. He stopped at Petty Officer Miller's station. The young man was staring at his black monitor. "You did well today, Miller," Vance said. His voice was tired but firm. "You found the contact when the machine couldn't." Miller looked up. "Captain, I keep thinking about that drone. Who does it belong to? If it can do that to us and to them, what is the point of all this?" He gestured to the dead consoles. Vance did not have an answer. He looked at the red emergency lights. "The point is that we are still here, and the tankers are still moving. The rest of it is for the people in Washington to figure out." The captain returned to the bridge. He looked out at the empty sea. The crisis had resolved. No missiles had flown in the end. No ships had been lost. There were no medals to be won for a war that was stopped by a ghost. There was only the long, slow trip home. The morning was now bright and clear. The heat of the day was beginning to rise. 6:15 in the evening. 18 hours after the encounter in the Strait of Hormuz, the USS Abraham Lincoln moved through the North Arabian Sea. The massive aircraft carrier was a floating city of steel and jet fuel. Inside the flag bridge, Admiral James Merrick stared at a series of printed photographs spread across a mahogany table. The digital displays in the room were functioning, but the data coming from the Persian Gulf was fragmented and unreliable. The Admiral looked at the image of the USS Indianapolis. It was taken by a Seahawk helicopter 2 hours ago. The littoral combat ship was being towed by a fleet tug toward a dry dock in Jebel Ali. The black scorch marks on its port side were a stark reminder of how close the world had come to a total war. The Chief of Staff stood across from him. "The technical teams from 7th Fleet are already on board the Indianapolis, sir. They are reporting something unprecedented. It is not just a software crash. The logic gates in the primary processors have been physically altered at the atomic level. It is as if the hardware was rewritten by a high-intensity focused energy pulse." Merrick rubbed his eyes. "And the Higgins. The Higgins is back at 70% capacity," the Chief of Staff replied. "They were further away from the epicenter. Their shielding held. But their Link 16 data link is still garbage. They are communicating via blinking light and old-school high-frequency radio." 6:45 in the evening. A secure military complex in northern Tehran. General Rezai walked through a hall filled with broken servers. The smell of ozone and melted plastic was thick in the air. His best cyber warfare specialists were hunched over workstations, trying to salvage anything from the wreckage of the Coastal Defense Network. "General," a colonel said, standing at attention. "The results are the same. The Fateh missiles are inert. The guidance chips are blank. It is as if they were never programmed. We have lost the entire first-tier strike capability in the southern sector." Rezai looked out the window toward the Alborz Mountains. "Did the Americans use a new weapon?" The colonel shook his head. "Our sensors on the coast recorded a massive electromagnetic spike, but it did not originate from the American ships. It came from directly above, at 62,000 feet. The signature does not match any known U.S. drone." It was a frequency we have never encountered. 7 o'clock in the evening. The strategic fallout was beginning to take shape in the halls of power. In Washington and Tehran, the rhetoric was surprisingly muted. There were no public threats of retaliation. There were no televised speeches about sovereignty or aggression. Both nations were quietly trying to understand a power that had reached into their most advanced weapons and turned them into scrap metal. The Norwegian tanker Tancred had reached its destination. The oil was being offloaded. The global markets had spiked for an hour during the crisis, but they had settled as soon as the news of the de-escalation broke. To the rest of the world, it was just another close call in a dangerous neighborhood. Inside the Admiral's stateroom on the Lincoln, Merrick picked up a secure phone. "This is Merrick. Give me the Pentagon. I need to speak with the chairman." A moment later, a voice came through the line. "Admiral, we are seeing your reports. What is your assessment?" Merrick looked at the photo of the Indianapolis one last time. "My assessment is that we were saved by something we do not understand. If those missiles had hit, we would be in a full-scale regional conflict right now. Someone, or something, decided that was not going to happen. They treated two of the most advanced militaries on the planet like children playing with matches." The voice on the other end was silent for a long time. "Do we have a track on the drone?" "No, sir," Merrick said. "It vanished off the edge of the world, but I have a feeling it is still watching." The sun set over the Arabian Sea. The water turned a deep and endless black. The ships of the carrier strike group continued their patrol, but the sense of total dominance had evaporated. The rules of engagement had changed, and neither side knew the new laws of the sky. 7:45 in the evening. A windowless room at the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland. The digital reconstruction of the encounter in the Strait of Hormuz was played back for a small group of senior analysts. On the wall-sized screen, the paths of the missiles and the movements of the ships were rendered in clean, white lines. The data was incomplete. Large sections of the telemetry were missing, erased by the same pulse that had neutralized the hardware. The lead analyst stood at the front of the room. He held a laser pointer, but he did not use it. "What we are looking at is not a tactical failure. It is a strategic shift. For 30 years, we have built our defense around the idea of network-centric warfare. We assumed that the side with the best data would win. We never considered a scenario where the data itself becomes the vulnerability." He paused, looking at the senior officers in the front row. The drone that intervened was not using a traditional jammer. It was not shouting over our signal. It was speaking to our systems in a Dakta, language they already understood. It bypassed every firewall, every encryption layer, and every physical air gap. It did the same to the Iranians. It simply removed the ability to kill from the equation. 3 days later, Jebel Ali Port, Dubai, the USS Indianapolis sat in a massive concrete dry dock. The water had been pumped out, revealing the extent of the damage. The port side was buckled and torn, scorched by the fragments of the Iranian missile. Teams of engineers in white coveralls crawled over the hull like ants. They were carrying specialized scanners, trying to find any trace of Nine, the energy pulse that had silenced the ship. Captain Vance stood on the floor of the dry dock, looking up at his vessel. Beside him stood a military attaché from the Norwegian embassy. The man had come to deliver a formal thank you for the rescue of the Tancred. "Your crew saved 2 million barrels of oil and 15 lives," the attaché said. "The world owes you a debt." Vance did not look away from the ship. "We did our job. But the truth is, we didn't stop that missile. Something else did. We were just the target." The captain knew that the official records would describe the event as a series of technical malfunctions and a successful defensive intercept. The mystery drone would be relegated to a classified annex, hidden away from the public and the politicians. But every Frenting sailor who was in the Combat Information Center that morning knew the truth. They had felt the silence. They had seen the machine stop. 1 week later, The Gulf of Oman. A new carrier strike group had arrived to relieve the USS Abraham Lincoln. The rotation was standard, part of the endless rhythm of global power projection. The quote, ships moved through the same waters where the Indianapolis had almost burned. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. The tankers were still moving. The jets were still flying. The tension remained, a permanent feature of the geography. But the strategic assessment was clear. The era of total human control over the battlefield was over. The incident in the Strait of Hormuz had proven that there was a silent watcher in the sky, a force that was willing to intervene when the risk of escalation became too high. It was a terrifying thought for the generals and the admirals. They were no longer the ultimate authority on the use of force. The final thought of the official report was buried in the last paragraph of the final page. It was written by a tactical analyst who had spent his entire career studying the Iranian military. Modern warfare is no longer decided by who fires first, but by who is allowed to fire at all. We have spent decades perfecting the art of the strike, but we have neglected the art of restraint. On that morning, we did not choose peace. Peace was forced upon us. We must now ask ourselves what happens when that force is no longer there to hold back the tide. The sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The ocean remained indifferent to the machines that sailed upon it, and the weapons that flew above it. It was a vast and ancient place, and for one brief morning, it had been the witness to a miracle of silence. The watch continued. The sky remained clear. For now, the world was still quiet.